Great. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. Um, Much of what I have to talk about is not great news, but I do like talking about it, and the fact that people care enough to listen is one of the only things that gives me a bit of hope these days. Everything I'm going to talk about is really an enormous team effort. I list some folks there, and I'll mention them again later. And there are other people that have worked on these issues with me over the last 20 years. And so I'm grateful to lots of people that I can't mention them all. The title that you see there is one I came up with some months ago when I first agreed to give this talk. I think if I was going to change the title today, I would change that in bit to be prioritizing species for conservation. I will talk a bit about the history of butterfly populations in the West and threats. But I really am interested these days in how we focus on particular species and groups of species for conservation attention moving forward. So I usually start with some headlines, although I suspect if you are tuning in to a Xerces webinar, you don't need to be reminded that there have been problems with insects, and insect declines are real and quite serious. These are just some headlines from the press. One could find lots more. This has been a big deal, and scientists have been surprised even. Although really looking back on the last couple of years, what it has been is just a reminder that insects are part of ecosystems, and you can't put billions of people on the planet without taking resources away from other organisms. And we are seeing the consequences of that. So how are we responding to fewer insects? The scope of the problem obviously calls for really big actions across scales, legal actions, education, community efforts, all kinds of things need to happen. And in some places are happening, thanks in not in small part to the efforts of Xerces and Xerces staff. Given the magnitude of what needs to happen, sometimes talking about single species and traditional single species conservation can feel a bit overwhelming or even hopeless. But I think it is the case and will remain the case that focusing on individual species, even given the enormous diversity of insects, like there's so many insects, how can we focus on a few? It is important. It's galvanizing for the public, for politicians. It's also galvanizing for researchers. It gives us something to focus on and individual species to learn things from about declines and threats. And I have personally have been really impressed over the last couple of years by the capacity of people, from the general public to scientists, to be interested in specific insects that are in decline. And whenever people want to talk to me about the monarch butterfly, which is a very important issue, I have said I'll tell you about 20 or 30 butterflies that are in more severe decline in the West. So how do we know that, and how do we pick species to think about and focus on for conservation? And here's the point where I put a reminder there to myself to say that butterflies are not representative of all insects. We know more about individual butterfly species than about species of any other lineage of insect. So that's an important distinction. It means that we can do more with butterflies, but as you'll see, a theme that I try to develop here is that we need tools to move forward even when knowledge is imperfect. And so I hope that some of the things I'm going to suggest we can eventually start to do with other groups of insects as well. Traditionally, the identification of at-risk species for conservation has focused on species with small ranges, fragmented ranges, and narrow ecological requirements. If a particular species lives on only a couple of stretches of beach in some part of California, then we know it's going to be threatened and imperiled. And given not lacking any other information, that's a reasonable place to start for conservation. If you think about a continuum of risk factors from species with large contiguous ranges and generalized ecological habits, the ability to eat different host plants, et cetera, at one end of a continuum. And then at the other end, you think about really small fragmented ranges and specialized ecologies. What I want to suggest is that we actually need to be thinking about that whole spectrum for conservation. And in fact, I want to suggest a complementary approach that is really inspired by the fact that many wide-ranging species are in decline. And we need to think about how to sort of focus on particular species over at that end of the continuum, as well as a complementary approach to our traditional focus on narrow-ranged habitat specialists. So all the work I'm going to talk about is based on data sets, these three data sets primarily. And I'm not going to get into too many methodological nitty-gritty here, but just so you know where the information is coming from. On the left there is Art Shapiro's data set, as was mentioned. My former advisor from UC Davis started monitoring these sites in the 1970s. So a couple of these sites, the ones that started earliest, have just turned 50 years this last season, which is pretty amazing. It makes it one of the world's longest running insect observational data sets, and certainly North America's longest. Art is still collecting data at the low elevation sites. Out of my lab, we've started collecting data at the mountain sites. You'll hear more about that data later. In the middle there, all of those dots and the color coding is by elevation, just so you can see the elevational variation, which indicates habitat variation as well. Those are all places where NABA, North American Butterfly Association, 4th of July counts happen. They're not only on the 4th of July, but they tend to be midsummer. It's one day when a group of butterfly enthusiasts go out and census all the butterflies in a given area. This is something anybody can participate in. You can Google it if you're interested. I think it's a great program. And on the right there are iNaturalist records for butterflies from the last 20 years from the Western US, which is an amazing resource, really incredible data. I'm not going to talk too much about it today. We're actually still sort of finding new ways to learn things from that iNaturalist data. And in many ways, that kind of crowdsourced community scientist data is the future of what we're going to learn about butterflies responding to the Anthropocene, which is the age that we live in. Okay, so before I get to my main interest these days of picking butterflies for conservation interests, I want to give you a lightning tour of what we know about the status of butterflies in the West. Roughly 3/4 of species of butterflies in the West have some degree of detectable downward trajectory over time. What I mean by that is fewer individuals seen at individual locations over the years. 3 data sets that I mentioned agree on that. Those histograms there are just summarizing species with either positive or negative trends over time. The gray bars are negative, and in red is the percentage of species that have those downward trajectories. Some of them very slight, some of them very severe, and you'll see some of that as we go on. Overall declines in densities of adult butterflies are on the order of 1.6% per year, and we have quite high confidence in that number. That number is based on data from those once per year NABA censuses conducted primarily by community scientists. It's worth dwelling on that number for a moment because I think it's really important. First, it's squarely in the range of 1 to 2% annual loss that has been observed in other parts of the world for butterflies and also for other insects. So there's a rather remarkable consistency in that result. And 1.6%, anything in the 1.2% sounds like a small number, but of course it's a compounded loss. That's per year, which stacks up really quickly. You would not be happy if your bank account was losing 1.6% of its value per year. To make it more concrete, if you imagine a mountain meadow full of butterflies that you might have visited 20 years ago, and let's say that you saw 1,000 individual butterflies on an afternoon of looking at insects, which isn't hard to imagine. If you go back to that same meadow today, our results predicts that you would see about 725 individual butterflies, more than a quarter loss, resulting from this compounded annual decrease. That's pretty dramatic and will certainly have cascading consequences on ecosystems for pollination and other things over the course of coming years that we are fortunately are going to get a chance to understand. Okay, so what about causes of these declines? In areas where comparisons can be made, we see comparable effects of direct habitat loss and pesticides, in other words, equally negative effects. Effects of climate change are pervasive and possibly as severe as other stressors. That bullet point, I sort of smile a bit as I summarize that in one bullet point, because that's actually the result of about 20 years of work, is trying to understand those things. So I want to dwell on what's packed into that bullet point a little bit. With respect to comparable effects of direct habitat loss and pesticides, that statement is a little bit surprising to some folks because traditionally conservation biology, we've sort of assumed that habitat loss would be the main thing. And in some ways, it has to always be the main thing. But what's amazing is in the remaining habitat, we think there are equally detrimental effects of contamination of that habitat, specifically by pesticides. How do we know that? We know that from analyses of our long-term data, which stretches back 50 years now at some sites, for those 4 low elevation sites that I've highlighted there with the arrows in red. Those are in the Central Valley and in the Bay Area there. That's an elevational profile, sorry, I should have said that, of Northern California, where you see the Coast Range and then the Sierra Nevada. The years next to the sites are the years that continuous sampling began. So we've taken data from those low elevation sites, and we've observed first some pretty dramatic losses, which are interesting in that they seem to show a kind of step change or sharp downward trend in the 90s. What you see in this graph here, the dots are in numbers of butterfly species observed in particular years at particular sites. The color coding is different sites. That doesn't matter for the moment. What matters is that things were, messy and bouncing around until the 90s, and then we see this downward trajectory. Habitat loss in the Central Valley has been remarkably continuous and severe, going well back before the 1970s. What changed in the 1990s was the rise of a new class of pesticides, neonicotinoids, which you see here graphed with the 3 colored lines. Well, there's blue and red and then kind of a weird gray going up. That's on a log scale. Those are exponential rises in the rate of application of neonicotinoids. The lines in the background are traditional classes of pesticides, pyrethroids and others that have been used in the Central Valley for a long time. Those are very impactful and negative as well, but what happened in the 90s was this introduction of neonicotinoids, which have uniquely detrimental properties in terms of accumulating in habitats near agriculture, etc. What was remarkable in our work with this is that we were able statistically to estimate the effects of habitat loss and pesticides. We see them to be of equally negative consequence. I could say more about how we know that if people are interested. So that's comparable effects of those 2 stressors or negative forces. What about climate change? Effects of climate change are pervasive. In the Central Valley, we see that climate change kind of takes a second place, or actually a third place, after those competing negative effects of habitat loss and pesticides. But in the West, we have a lot of places that are pretty far removed from development and even from pesticides. And a question that we asked recently, this was actually our big pandemic project in 2020. I spent much of my time looking at this computer working on this issue. Looking at the data from those NABA 4th of July counts, which you see there, and again, the colors are just elevational variation. But elevational variation is important. Cooler colors, the yellows to the greens, are higher elevation, which is to say they're more removed from development. We asked if we could understand which places have seen more butterflies over time and which places have seen fewer butterflies over time as a function of various things that include proximity to development, agriculture, general climatic conditions, which places are hotter or drier, wetter, and climate change, rates of change in those climatic conditions. And the results were actually a bit surprising in how clear they are. So what you see there is a list of things that we put into statistical work to ask if we could see an association between variables and rates of change on the landscape. The things that came to the top were 2 climate change variables in particular, the rate of fall warming and the rate of summer warming. And this is actually interesting climatologically. I'm not a climatologist, obviously. I'm a butterfly biologist, but I've been trying to learn about the climate. Rate of climate warming is not equal in space, which maybe isn't as surprising, but it's not equal across the season either. Some parts of the year are warming faster than others, and even it's not even consistent throughout the day. The night is warming faster than the day, and the night is warming faster than the day at higher elevations. That's all a lot of very interesting complexity that we're starting to understand. What we learned here is that warming fall temperatures have a very high negative effect. Summer warming temperatures have a positive effect. That's complicated. I don't want to spend too much time on it. warming summer temperatures are probably somewhat good for observations of ectotherms, which are insects, things that receive their sort of, you know, energy budget externally from the sun. If you're doing this once a year community monitoring and you go out on a July day that's slightly warmer than the July day you went out last year, you might see more individual butterflies flying around while controlling for all these other factors. But higher than that is the effect of warming fall temperatures, which you can see here. On the x-axis here is the difference between fall and summer warming. To the farther right on the x-axis represents locations where fall is warming more rapidly than summer, and those identified dots, which are locations in the lower right quadrant here, which are places where the rate of change in butterfly density has been below 1. In other words, fractionally decreasing over time. Biologically, this was an exciting and interesting result. In terms of conservation, it's daunting because it means that many of the open spaces of the West, even if they're far removed from development, are being quite negatively impacted by climate change. We also included in this statistical work proximity to urbanization and crops, and those came all the way at the bottom of the list. And I want to say a word about that result because this was covered in the press a fair bit, and I'd like to take the opportunity to clarify. Oh, I should also say that those things labeled MEM there, that's not interesting for the moment. That's accounting for some spatial issues in sampling that sort of makes our statistics appropriate for clustered areas in space. That's not interesting. What is interesting is that urbanization and crops in this analysis did not come out as having much of a negative impact on butterfly declines, but that's because the NABA sites, the North American Butterfly Association 4th of July counts, are mostly in very nice places, fairly removed from urban lands and agricultural lands. You see that in these histograms here. This is a fraction of urbanized lands at individual sites. The tall peaks indicate that most of the sites were very removed. And even in cases where community scientists, for example, in the Bay Area or near LA, go out to a preserved area that's very close to the city, they tend to pick places that are really nice. And there really is some amazing habitat left near those urban areas. And there are some butterflies that are doing well there. And this is an important point that I'll come back to later, the idea that we might still have some really nice butterflies very close to urban and agricultural land. Okay, so given that result, my prediction is that climate change actually has a very large negative effect on butterflies in the US. Our data was only from the West. Let's look at how the climate has been changing. And I'm sure everybody has seen graphs like this before. This one is interesting to me because it was focused, it was from a publication focused on national parks. So these folks wanted to ask if US national parks are being disproportionately impacted by climate change. And you remember I said that climate change is not homogeneous across the landscape. And in fact, US national parks are very much disproportionately affected by climate change because most of our national park land is in the Western US. It's a little bit hard to see, but in this map here, there's lots of green outlines, which are national parks. And of course, there are some in the East, but there's lots in the West. And look at where the hot colors are. The hot orange, yellow colors are places where there is more warming temperatures over recent decades. The West is really cooking in a dramatic way relative to the East. Here you see rates of drying where those salmon colors are areas that are drying out because of climate change. And again, it's largely concentrated in the West. Okay, well, this disproportionate warming and drying across the US unfortunately sets up an interesting experiment with butterflies. We see butterflies declining in the West. If we're correct that climate change is having is seriously contributing to that, then our prediction would be that butterflies in the eastern US might not be doing quite as badly as in the West. We didn't look at butterflies in the East. I'm always very focused on the 11 Western states because it's the lands that I feel responsible for. These authors, luckily, shortly after our paper came out, took the same NABA data from the entire country and looked at rates of change in butterfly density. And they found a result that I think is pretty shocking and interesting with respect to climate change. Here's their result across all butterfly species, just rates of change in density. The hotter colors, the oranges and the yellows, are fewer butterflies over time. And you can see that those are concentrated in the West. And they really pretty closely map to those climate change maps I showed. Areas that are warming and drying are seeing fewer butterflies over time. So those are the pervasive effects of climate change. So it still leaves us with this desire to compare all of these things, because I said habitat loss and pesticides remarkably have comparable effects. And then outside of those developed areas, we know that climate change is quite severe, especially across the Western US. What about all of those stressors compared? Now we're back to the Shapiro data set, where we actually have a globally unique chance to compare areas that are impacted by all stressors, development, pesticides, climate change, more invasive species. All of that is happening in the Central Valley of California. We can compare that to the geographically proximate mountains, where really it's about climate change. Sure, there are invasive species in the mountains and there's some development, but our sites that we've been monitoring, in some cases for 50 years, are quite removed from development. So comparing rates of change in butterflies in the valley versus the mountain here gives us a really nice comparison, which has not been possible in other parts of the world. For example, in Europe, where they have some excellent long-term monitoring programs, they don't tend to have the topographic complexity and mountains that we have in the West. This is a complicated looking graph, but there's an important message here that's worth, there's a reason I put it up. On the lower graph there, you see rates of change in butterfly densities at the low elevation spots. So that's all the Central Valley locations and one low elevation Coast Range spot. The axes there, what's being depicted are these standardized population indices that go from positive to negative, centered around 0. More positive values are simply good years for butterflies, accounting for all kinds of stuff, and negative values are worse years for butterflies. What you can see is in the Central Valley, there was a real downturn in the 90s, which I showed you before when I was talking about pesticides. There was some kind of a step change in that time frame, and basically the Central Valley butterflies have stayed at that lower level since then. But in the mountains, and it's messy here, there's lots of things going on, but the mountains were really quite stable through the 90s, and we see a more severe downturn happening really since 2010. Not coincidentally, our mega drought years of 2011 to 2015, which is what's highlighted with that little gray bracket under the red box, those were the millennium, 1,000-year drought that the West experienced. That impacted the mountains quite severely, even though it does look like they were going down a little bit before then. And we've identified warming nighttime temperatures as really being detrimental to butterflies in the mountains. But what's impressive here is that the magnitude of change is fairly comparable between the low and high elevations. From that, we infer that the whole suite of factors in the Central Valley, which is mainly dominated by pesticides and development, is actually rivaled by the downturn at higher elevations, which is due, we think, almost solely to climate change. And a caveat here is that we are not able to quantify impacts of various other things like invasive species, which is why I mainly talk about climate change, habitat loss, and pesticides. Those are the things that we can learn about. Okay, that was that bullet point. That was a lot packed in there. I'm going to start moving a little bit faster now as we get into identification of individual species for conservation. I also want to note that there is lots more to learn here. We are not by any means done with understanding effects of climate change on butterflies. In particular, we'd like to know if effects are more often realized through direct stress on caterpillars, for example, or on stress through plants. There's interesting biology there, but we also know that we're in a time, Rome is burning, and we can't just fiddle, even though we like to fiddle and we like to learn things about basic biology. We need to figure out what to do. Now, a real challenge moving forward, and this bullet point looks like a mouthful, but I'll tell you what I mean. Declines among species are so taxonomically ubiquitous that our ability to understand who is declining and why, it really hasn't worked out very well. what I mean by that mouthful is this, is that if I tell you that some species are in severe decline and some are doing okay and some are in less severe decline, maybe even increasing, we would like to be able to take species traits like body size, host plant use, geographic range, et cetera, et cetera. Volcanism is the number of generations per year. We'd like to be able to predict who's in more or less severe decline. Because if we could do that very successfully, then we could turn to other butterflies for which we don't have good monitoring data, which is a majority of butterflies in the West. And we could say, well, this butterfly here, I don't actually know what your historical trajectory is, but I know that you have a combination of traits that tends to be associated with decline. Let's worry about you. Let's go initiate monitoring for you. That hasn't worked out very well. Here's just one data slide to show you how poorly it works out. We have identified that species with more broods or generations per year do slightly better in the West, especially in the face of climate change. You can imagine that makes sense. You're more resilient if you have more generations per year. But on the left there is the magnitude of the effect. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Those two blue bars are very slightly different. If you have 2 or more generations per year, you're doing slightly better over time, but that is very subtle. The subtleness of that means that we're learning something about that biology, but it's pretty challenging to turn to other species and say, aha, here are the traits associated with decline. It's a serious challenge for conservation. Here's a strategy that we are trying to pursue moving forward. So first, organize species based on whatever demographic data we can get. What I mean is, changes in density over time. And we're going to start out by acknowledging that we don't have data on all species. Eventually, I want to build a framework where we can include species even without that data. Say more about that later. And also acknowledging that there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to understanding insect populations. And I'll show you that uncertainty in a minute. Then we want to layer on that different lines of evidence, including those species-specific traits. Even if they have little explanatory power, we want to use what we can, and we want to layer on exposure to different threats, which is key. I'll show you that in a second. We hope to emerge with a subset of species with biological and geographic diversity that will be useful for motivating action and research. And I hope, I'm going to show you a preliminary list now, and it's preliminary, but some of the species at the top of that list, I think you'll be surprised. They're very widespread, wide-ranging species that are doing very poorly, which is surprising. It is not what we expected to be doing in conservation biology 20 or 30 years ago, focusing on very wide-ranging, even generalist species. I'm not going to dwell on methods here, but if anybody has a background in wildlife or quantitative biology, you might be interested to know we're running we're developing specific statistical models that let us understand historical population trends and then forecast into the future, which is difficult to do. And we're trying to do it with insect populations, which are famously variable. I'll show you that in a second. And like I already said that the list of species I'm going to show you for the top decliners is preliminary, but I'm hoping over the coming months we will finalize this. Okay. So now I'm actually, I want to check my time here really quick. Okay, yeah, it's good. I appreciate you paying attention to this. I know that it's not easy to listen to people talk on a computer. Okay, but I'm going to get more excited now because this is even though it's still depressing, this is what excites me in terms of results that we're working on right now. The dots you see in this graph are individual butterfly species, about 160 of them, for which we have enough historical data to do this. And by this, I mean estimate 2 things. On the x-axis there are historical rates of population change. If you remember from high school biology, you might have encountered lambda from ecology, which is the rate of change over time. If lambda is 1, it means the population is stable. You can see on the x-axis there that most of the points are to the left of 1, which is to say there are widespread declines. We know this. The y-axis is new here. This is a result of our most recent work. We're excited about this. This is taking the historical trends, turning around and projecting into the future, projecting 50 years into the future, and the fractional values on that axis represent our projection for how many of the currently occupied locations will be occupied by given species at least 50 years into the future. So anything less than 1 is not great, Insect populations are notoriously bouncy. They jump around. It's not surprising that many would be less than one. These are not perfect, what we're doing here, these models, but the relative position of species on these axes is important and useful. And if these models were perfect, if we had amazing data for these species, we might just say, well, these species down here both have experienced great losses in the past, and they're projected to have very low rates of occupancy as 50 years. 20% occupancy is pretty bad. 20% of the species of the locations that you're currently in now, you could be found in 50 years in the future. We might just say, well, let's focus on those. But this is data from once per year censusing for insects, which it's amazing data, but it's also thin from the mathematical perspective. And the thinness is reflected in uncertainty. These error bars here, so basically these are margins of errors that operate in two directions. Our uncertainty about the past and our uncertainty about the future. Uncertainty is large. It's not overwhelmingly large. It's not so large as to say we don't understand which species are in very severe decline versus doing okay, but it is sufficiently large that I'm not comfortable just saying, these species down here are the ones that we want to worry about. We need more information. It could be the case, for example, and this is an important point, there could be a species just in the middle of this graph that maybe by chance has been doing okay at monitoring sites. Because remember, these are monitoring sites where community scientists go out and they pick pretty nice places to look for butterflies. Species might be doing okay in the historical data, but they might be at risk from other factors, like being very close to the edge of a city where you're likely prone to development, which is why we want to pile on different lines of evidence. Here's what two lines of evidence look like. I'm excited by this sort of recent addition to the information that we can include. What you see here is the geographic range for this skipper butterfly, Pleiades sabuleti. It's the range drawn twice. On the left is the range where urban development is highlighted, the little dark purple areas. And then on the right there is that landscape colored with respect to rate of warming in fall temperatures. So what we can do now is we can characterize this species with respect to its exposure to those two things. The fraction of its land that encompasses development, and we can do this for agriculture as well, the fraction of its land that encompasses severe fall warming, which we know from our previous work is a risk factor for butterflies. Here's just another species, this one contrasting with the past. Notice that the range of sabuleti includes some hot colors down there in the southwest. Those are areas, I shouldn't say hot, the darker purple colors are areas that are really rapidly warming in the fall. Contrast that to this species, which is really encompassing areas that are cooking quite rapidly in the fall, while this species doesn't include as many areas of intense urban development. Okay, so how do we use that kind of information? Let me show you one perspective on it, and then I'm going to put a whole bunch of lines of information together, and I promise I will get to this list that I'm promising. The dots here, ignore the colors for the moment. The dots are the same dots I showed you before. So these are species organized by their historical rate of change, their projected rate of change. On top of that, I've layered these colors which indicate exposure to both ag and urban development, with hotter colors being more exposed. What's fascinating here, and this is going to look counterintuitive at first, the red arrows there point to 15 species with the most extreme exposure to ag and urban development. Now you might say, why is it not the case that exposure to ag and urban development would be concentrated down in the lower left where we see the species in most severe decline? It's interesting and it's complicated. Part of it is simply, as I mentioned before, that these are community scientist data sets where people have picked relatively good areas to census butterflies. But then when we look at the whole range of butterflies, they often encompass ag and urban areas. So we might have a species that's actually been doing pretty well where it's studied, but that doesn't mean a large part of its range isn't at risk because it's encompassing ag and urban areas. It's also the case that there are other risk factors, and we are pretty confident that climate change is as impactful as development in the West for impacting butterflies. So it's not surprising that rates of overall decline aren't simply explained by exposure to ag and urban development. Okay, let's move on and let's get to the point in terms of the ranking. We want to put all this information together. And now I'm not trying to take risk factors and predict who's in decline. I'm saying that all of this information is imperfect, but I'm taking our estimates of decline, actually our projected occupancy, which is what you see in that green wedge there, how present do we expect the species to be on the landscape in the future, and then all of these other sort of risk factors and lines of information, including Shapiro there. So that's the data set that my lab partly collects now in the mountains. It's denser data, but it's available for fewer species because it's a narrow geographic area. But for species that are also in the Shapiro data, I want to weight that information quite highly. What I do is I have a scheme for adding all of this up in a standardized way that gives me a weighted sum, which I can use to rank species based on all of this information. Going back to this graph here, which is just organizing species based on the monitoring data, I'm going to now lay on top of here colors where hotter colors are going to be more severely declining species. And what you're going to see is that there's some, if you can see these colors, and I'll show it in a way in a second that's easier to see. The hotter colors do tend to be down toward the lower left, which makes sense because now that I'm piling up all the risk factors that I've got, it should somewhat organize species being down there to the left. But the whole reason I wanted to take this multiple lines of information approach is I wanted to allow for the possibility that our monitoring scheme might not capture some of the most at-risk species. And indeed, that seems to work. So if I take my combined information approach and I rank species based on the overall risk factor, I identify lots of species down here, but I pull up many from the middle of the graph that are at risk for things that might not include simply what's been observed at the monitoring sites. And now I'm going to show you what a few of those species look like. So I apologize, it's a very complicated slide. I'll show you what's here. And then basically I'm just going to show you some report cards for individual species, grim report cards. And then I'll be winding it up. I aim to end well before the hour. Let me show you what's in these graphs here. So that's Vanessa annabella, which I put first here because in my mind, it's kind of become a poster child, or it should become a poster child for butterfly conservation in the West. You can see its range there from Jeffrey Glasper's book, The Swift Guide to Butterflies in North America. The colors aren't important for the moment. They're different numbers of generations per year. But boy, this species really represents the Western US. It is not a species a priori that anyone would have predicted to be in decline. It's large, it's dispersive, it has a number of hosts that can eat, exotic and native hosts. In many areas, it's one of the first butterflies to turn up in the spring. That makes us feel like it's a pretty hardy overwintering species. Nevertheless, it is always at the top of the list in terms of rates of decline. Here you see averaged information across NABA sites, which are in the little inset. General downward trajectory over time, fairly consistent and sort of grinding on year after year a little bit downward. Here you see from the Shapiro sites, which are from low elevations and then from high elevations, inexorable declines at these sites that are really mind-blowing for me for a wide-ranging dispersive species. Each graph there is a geographic location. The y-axes are simple here. They're easy to interpret. They're the fraction of days in which you see this butterfly. So hopefully you can see my pointer. I'm focusing on the one that says Gates Canyon, which is sort of that sort of lime green color there. This is a site where there were years in the 80s where you would very reliably see this animal on 70, 80% of the days that you went out. Now it's approaching local extirpation. You might only see it on 10% of the days. And that's just the story across these sites. And it's a fascinating case of shifting baseline. We were out this summer, of course, monitoring the high elevation sites. And there were a couple of sites where we saw this butterfly on a couple of days. And we were all excited, like, it's having a great year. It's not a great year. It's a miserable year for an animal that you used to just see on 50 to 80% of the days that you were out. Quite remarkable. Here's a risk breakdown. This is some of the risk factors, not all of them. Bars that go upwards are ones where those are the risk factors for this animal. The risk factors for this animal are just that we've observed it doing poorly. We don't understand why this animal is doing badly. This is part of what I want to do, is motivate research on species like this. The other risk factors are either just flat or they're actually pointing the other direction. For example, geographic range. we normally would have considered a wide geographic range something that would convey resilience. But what you'll see is I've got a bunch of wide-ranging species that are not resilient. Um, Here's this animal again. I showed this skipper before, Sabuleti. You see, this is a species that's observed to be in decline both in the NABA data and the Shapiro data. It has one notable risk factor in that it encompasses some of those really hot and dry warming areas of the Southwest. Here's the monarch for comparison. It is not observed to be in as severe decline in the NABA data for sure. It actually is in slightly more severe decline in the Shapiro data, but still, regardless of the data set, there tend to be about 20 to 40, 50 species in more severe decline than the monarch, with an important caveat that the monarch is fairly unique in having one very large population, of course, in the West. And that is its own kind of risk factor that's not actually encompassed in this. Nevertheless, I am confident in saying that we have many species that are in more dramatic downward trajectories. Here's Xanthoides, this little Lycaenid. This has a pretty interesting mix of risk factors. In other words, lots of things give us confidence in this butterfly is at risk, including being observed to be at risk in the Shapiro data set, but also exposure to development, small geographic range. It doesn't encompass areas that are cooking in the fall. But you can see in the Shapiro data set, it's approaching local extirpation in many places. Here's another species with another complicated mix of risk factors. Oh, wait a minute, did I want to say something else about? Sorry. Oh yeah, Catullus. I do like to mention that this is a species that represents an interesting paradox, I think, for the butterflies of the West and probably butterflies for the modern era. This was a species that was so abundant in the second half of the 20th century that it was something you could find in almost every weed lot in the Central Valley. So I grew up in the Central Valley, and it was something that kids would know and like call a moth because it's brown, right? Now it's been extirpated from many of the sites where we look at it, exceedingly rare. What happened? Mid-20th century, it had actually colonized exotic host plants and was doing quite well, quite abundant in modified landscapes, agricultural and urban landscapes. But then by the end of the 20th century, it had entered this nosedive. My suspicion is those exotic plants were actually not bad to eat, but they exposed the animal to increasing accumulations of pesticides and other stressors. In other words, those exotic plants acted like a kind of a trap eventually for this species. Complicated trajectory, but it's one that we see in a number of cases for the butterflies of the West. Here's the California dogface. I put it up here as an example because it's observed in a bit of decline in the NABA data, very subtle. As you can see here, that red line is practically flat. It's not observed to be in decline in the Shapiro data set, but it is massively exposed to California development. You see that tall bar here. So I would suggest this is a species we should worry about just because of exposure to development and some evidence of historical decline. This is another species I knew growing up. The last one I saw was 20 years ago. I mean, partly I'm not currently living in its range, but it has become harder to see in that Bay Area to Sacramento Valley for sure. Another skipper with downward trajectories and a complicated mix of risk factors. I was talking to one of my co-authors on this work, and they said, you should throw in a species that's doing well. Otherwise, it's just too much. Here's a species that seems to be doing pretty well. So Rudolus is a common swallowtail of the West. You can see mostly upward trajectories at the Shapiro sites, an impressive upward trajectory in the NABA sites. Where I am in Reno, it does quite well in the urban environment. It's able to eat a number of trees that grow here. So there are winners among the losers in the Anthropocene, and we can see those in the butterflies as well. But of course, our goal was actually to set out to identify species to think about for conservation. And we have a list of very widespread species that I think are fascinating and motivating new opportunities for conservation and research. When we're doing, for example, restoration, perhaps for the monarch butterfly, we can think about including host plants of these species in the mix. I think these are species that everyone, community scientists, can focus on with respect to reporting observations by naturalists and other sources. It is all extremely valuable data. Even if you see a single Vanessa Annabella, the West Coast lady, which is what you see in background there. That's my new poster child. If you see one of those in the summer and you post that observation to iNaturalist, we will use it in research. So please contribute to that or other sources, eButterfly. There are lots of opportunities for contributing data these days. Butterflies are just unique in the fact that you can take a picture with your phone and contribute really important data. It's also the case, and this is maybe more of an academic point, but it actually touches on the value of community scientist data as well. My main organizing framework there with the NABA data was based on that once per year community scientist sampling. Historically, wildlife biologists, academic biologists might have looked at once per year sampling and said like, that's maybe not enough. We're not going to build population models and forecasts with that, but it can be done as long as you acknowledge the uncertainty and use other lines of information at the same time. More work needs to be done, of course, in all kinds of ways. From my perspective, we're expanding this framework and we're figuring out ways to include species, even if they're not part of the monitoring schemes. And this gets back to that continuum of risk. And you remember, I pointed out at the beginning that traditionally insect conservation, we focused on those small range species, fragmented ranges. Very important that we not forget about those species. They are, of course, at risk. In many cases, because of their small ranges, they're not encompassed in the monitoring programs just by the chance of where they live. But because of the regions in which they live, we can probably say something about how they likely are at risk. If other butterflies in a large region are declining, then we could say it might be likely that this species is also declining. Let's include it into this big framework. So hopefully, I hope to go from 167 species, which is what I've been showing you, to hundreds of species. Hopefully encountering most of the species in the West in which we can sort of quantitatively and usefully rank them for conservation. And with that, I think I'm happy that I stopped. Oh yeah, I was going to stop at 45. That's not too bad. Thanks to you, if you're still awake and listening. Thanks to lots of folks. Jeffrey Glassberg in particular has facilitated use of the NABA data. Thanks to Art Shapiro, my former advisor at UC Davis, for counting butterflies for 50 years and for loving butterflies. If it wasn't for Art, I wouldn't be talking to you about this today. And then all kinds of other folks that have helped with this data. Butterfliesofamerica.com has awesome images that they've let me use at various points over the years. The two citations I put there include much of the recent results here. If you don't have access to those, but would like them, email me and I will send you PDFs. My email is at the top there, forister@gmail.com. Much of this work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, which is very interesting these days, and that it has pivoted a bit and is now going out of its way to support global change, climate change research, which was not always the way. NSF is our, is the bastion of basic research in our country. And it is realizing now that the need to understand these things is so great that basic research needs to include response to climate change. And with that, I will definitely stop talking. And in whatever time is left, I would love to take questions. I love taking questions, and it's really the only sadness with the webinar world. It's not as easy to do that, but I think someone's going to help me focus on particular questions. So let me stop there. And there's a nice picture of the Melissa blue butterfly for you. Okay.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was super interesting. Yeah, it looks like we have about 5 minutes for questions. So I'll try to pick a couple here that are quicker. I definitely recommend people to reach out to Matt. There are some questions specifically, someone is starting their master's work. It sounds really interesting. Definitely reach out and start that conversation. There were a couple questions about pesticide exposure and why that wasn't factored into species ranking, and just specifically if drift of neonics used in agricultural and urban areas could be impacting species in natural areas and mountains, and could this be an additive impact to climate change?
So glad you asked, because it was in there indirectly. So we have just used proximity to agricultural areas as a proxy for exposure to drift, which is imperfect, But in terms of ranking species, I think it works. If there's a species that encompasses a large section of the Central Valley, then it is for sure being exposed to some pesticide drift, in contrast to a species that's only found out in the middle of the Great Basin where we have relatively little agriculture. I know that there are other types of information that can be amassed in terms of pesticides, but they're fairly state specific, and California has a lot of available information other Western states don't. So we have used that proximity, but we know that pesticide drift is a huge issue. We have looked at milkweeds, for example, near agriculture in the Central Valley, and every single milkweed we looked at in the Central Valley growing near agriculture, even growing in refuge, has pesticides accumulated in it. Oh, and also your previous comment about somebody working on their master's. If anybody here is looking to go to graduate school and has any experience identifying butterflies, yeah, go ahead and email me, because I am looking for folks.
All right, perfect. So this next question is kind of two parts. One, what does development mean in your risk breakdown? And the second part that I think kind of piggybacks on that is, what can gardeners and landscape managers do to improve the chances of endangered and all butterflies in those maybe more developed areas?
Yep. So in terms of what development means, we're taking a very broad definition here. These are layers of information that are made publicly available, and they include all these different categories: urban, impervious, urban, buildings, roads, suburban areas, etc. So anything that falls in that developed category, for this purpose, we are just using as exposure proximity to development. That could be parsed more finely. It's not something we're doing at the moment. What can folks do? So glad somebody asked, because I know it's a lot of sort of negative information. And in fact, when we have published the negative results of climate change in the West, it often can lead to despair, because one feels like, well, if climate change is impacting all the open spaces, what can we do? I think that the negative impacts of climate change across the West highlight the importance of what anyone can do in their backyard. Insects are, of course, remarkable in being able to drop out of the sky and appear in your backyard. So we need areas in backyards and city parks that have less toxins in them, more natives, just friendlier spaces for insects. And I'm very open-minded in terms of that. Planting natives is amazing. If you don't have the time or money to research natives, just having a weedier, messier yard is actually really great for insects. And I know that Xerces has lots of great information posted on natives and other yard management techniques.
Okay, perfect. So one last question here. Is there a specific iNaturalist project that we can contribute sightings of butterflies to?
Such a good question. That's something we need to do. And I'm hopeful that this work can lead to like the top 15 decliners that people can contribute to. But at the moment, anything contributed to iNaturalist we can find and use. So if you just contribute a butterfly sighting to iNaturalist, it will become part of data in the next coming years. And if we create a specific project, it will also encompass that data. So just go ahead and use iNaturalist and it'll get used.